The handle of the suitcase bit into the center of Lily's palm, a sharp, grounding pressure. She stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, surrounded by the muted hum of a city that never truly slept. Outside the window, the neon glow of Seoul bled into the apartment, casting long, cold blue shadows across the floor. The silence here was thick, heavier than the humid air pressing against the glass. She looked toward the kitchen, then back at the door. Every object in the room, the half-empty shelves, the neatly arranged books, felt like a prop in a play she had been performing for too long. She tightened her grip on the luggage. The air in the room seemed to thin, vibrating with the weight of the decision she had already made. She did not look at the clock. She did not look for a reason to stay. She simply let the reality of the empty space settle into her bones. Her pulse slowed, matching the stillness of the apartment. She drew a breath, steady and deep, and prepared to sever the final thread. The words formed in her throat, cold and deliberate. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I quit being a stepmother," she whispered. "Before we continue, if you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel." The sentence hit the walls and died instantly, swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the apartment. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if the very furniture were waiting for her to retract the statement. She did not. She watched the dust motes dance in the sliver of neon light cutting across the floor, noting how they moved without her permission. The declaration was a physical weight lifted from her chest, leaving a hollow space that felt, for the first time, like freedom. She released her grip on the suitcase handle, flexed her fingers, and felt the blood return to her palm. She turned toward the door, her movements sharp and efficient. The lock clicked. She did not look back. The subway station at Myeongdong was a river of movement, a relentless surge of bodies moving in perfect, synchronized patterns. Lily stepped onto the platform, her presence a sudden friction against the smooth flow of the crowd. Everywhere she looked, the city demanded a specific rhythm, a way of walking, a way of looking, a way of being that she could not replicate. She moved through the fluorescent glare, her stride longer, her posture different from the sea of people pressing past her. Shoulders brushed against her, yet no one made eye contact. She was a ghost in the machinery of the city. She stopped near a pillar, letting the current of commuters break around her like water around a stone. The harsh overhead lights flattened every shadow, exposing the raw reality of her solitude. She watched a group of students laughing in unison, their movements mirrored, their expressions identical. She reached out to touch the cold metal of the station wall, grounding herself. The noise was deafening, yet it did nothing to fill the hollow space within. 3 years earlier, the air at Incheon Airport had felt thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and something sharp, like crushed pine. Lily stepped through the sliding glass doors, her pulse quickening with every stride. She gripped the handle of her suitcase, the leather warm against her palm, and scanned the terminal for a sign of the life she had been promised. In her pocket, the teaching contract was a folded square of paper, a tangible anchor in a sea of unfamiliar characters and rapid-fire speech. She navigated the terminal, her eyes darting between the digital arrival boards and the sea of commuters. She stopped at a kiosk, unfolding a map that felt like a puzzle she was not yet equipped to solve. A transit official gestured toward the subway line, his movements precise and clipped. She nodded, offering a smile that was not returned, and turned toward the platform. The city beyond the glass was a sprawling grid of lights. She felt the weight of her belongings, the entirety of her past packed into 2 bags and pushed forward. She was ready to prove that she could belong. The bookstore in Hongdae was a sanctuary of dust motes and silence, a sharp departure from the relentless pace of the streets outside. Lily wandered the narrow aisles, her fingers tracing the spines of books she could not yet read. She turned a corner and stopped. A man stood by the poetry section, his head bowed, his posture rigid with a quiet, lingering weight. Beside him, a young boy held his hand, the child's grip tight, his eyes fixed on his father's shoes. The man was Min-ho. He spoke to the boy in a low, rhythmic tone, his voice devoid of the sharp edges Lily encountered everywhere else in the city. Lily watched them from the end of the aisle. She saw the way Min-ho's gaze lingered on the shelves, searching for something he could not name. There was a profound stillness in his presence, a gravity that seemed to anchor the space around him. It was a stability she had been starving for. She stepped forward, the floorboards creaking. Minho looked up, his expression guarded, then softened. The city's noise faded entirely. 6 months passed in a blur of coffee shop meetings and quiet walks along the Han River. When Minho asked her to move into his apartment, the decision felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. She packed her life into boxes, shedding the temporary nature of her previous existence. The apartment was a small, precise square of order. Every book on the shelf was aligned. Every surface was wiped clean. As she carried her first box through the threshold, the floorboards groaned. She spent the entire afternoon rearranging the kitchen cabinets, trying to find space for her own things without disrupting the existing order. Minho watched from the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. She wanted to be the bridge. She knelt on the floor, organizing her books alongside his, and felt the first true surge of belonging. She was no longer just a visitor. She looked toward the bedroom where Junho slept, her resolve hardening. She would be the glue. She would make this house a home. Lily approached the kitchen as if it were a laboratory for belonging. She decided that the heart of the home lived in the pot, and she would master the kimchi jjigae. She bought the ingredients from the local market, hauling heavy bags of cabbage and jars of fermented paste back to the apartment. The kitchen, usually a place of sterile order, soon became a workspace of raw ingredients. She chopped the vegetables with rhythmic precision, trying to mimic the speed she saw in the neighborhood women. Then came the chili paste. It was thick, pungent, and unforgiving. As she stirred the base, the vibrant red pigment seeped into the creases of her skin, staining her fingertips and cuticles deep crimson. She scrubbed at the color, but it held fast, a permanent mark of her labor. The scent of garlic and fermented spice filled the small space, clinging to the curtains and the air. She tasted the broth, adjusting the heat, sweating under the steam that rose from the stove. Every movement was calculated to prove she could hold her place here. She wiped her hands on a towel, leaving streaks of red behind, and looked at the bubbling pot. It was a messy, visceral effort, but she saw it as a bridge. She was literally coloring her own hands to match the life she was trying to build. Language was the next wall she had to climb. Lily spent her evenings reciting honorifics, her tongue stumbling over the complex suffixes that defined social hierarchy. She would stand before the mirror, practicing the polite forms, trying to make the sounds feel natural. But every time she opened her mouth to address Minho or the neighbors, the words felt like jagged stones. She would inhale, prepare the sentence, and then feel the muscles in her throat tighten. The honorifics were meant to show respect, to build a bridge, but in her mouth, they felt like knots. She would pause mid-sentence, her breath hitching, as she searched for the exact level of formality required. The silence that followed her hesitation was always filled with a polite, icy judgment. She tried to force the syllables out, but they caught, creating a physical blockage. She realized that even when she spoke their language, she was still speaking from the outside. The rhythm of the city, the cadence of the household, were a code she could not crack. She would swallow hard, lower her gaze, and retreat into the safety of silence, knowing that every word highlighted the distance. The table was set with precision, the steam from the kimchi jjigae rising in thin, curling ribbons. Lily placed the bowls down, the ceramic clinking softly against the wood. She sat across from Junho, watching him. He did not look up. His hands remained tucked under his thighs, his posture rigid. She pushed a small bowl of side dishes toward him, a silent invitation to eat, to engage, to acknowledge the effort she had poured into the meal. Junho did not reach for his chopsticks. Instead, he shifted his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. He turned his head toward the window, his profile sharp and unyielding. The food sat between them, cooling, the vibrant red broth losing its heat. Lily waited, her own hands resting flat on the table, watching the way he deliberately avoided her gaze. He remained a wall of stillness, a small, impenetrable barrier that refused to be breached. Every minute that passed without him picking up his spoon felt like a rejection of her entire presence in the apartment. The air in the kitchen grew heavy with the smell of fermented spice and stagnant expectation. Lily watched Junho, her fingers gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. She needed a breakthrough, a single moment of connection to justify the months of labor. She leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper, and asked him to pass the rice. She used the name she had practiced in the quiet of her room, the name she had hoped would eventually replace the distance between them. She called him son. Junho froze. He turned his head slowly, his eyes devoid of the warmth she craved. He looked at her, not with hatred, but with a clinical, detached precision that felt far worse. He did not pass the rice. Instead, he looked at her and corrected her with a single, sharp word. He called her teacher. The title landed in the space between them like a gavel strike. It was a formal, professional label that stripped away every ounce of intimacy she had tried to build. She felt the blood drain from her face as the reality settled in. The word echoed in the small kitchen, sealing the boundary she had spent months trying to dismantle. The apartment walls seemed to pulse with the weight of the silence. Every corner she had cleaned, every surface she had polished, now felt like a testament to her own invisibility. She needed air, a break from the suffocating stillness that defined her existence within those four walls. She stepped out into the evening, hoping the pulse of Seoul would offer some form of relief. Instead, the city felt like a closing fist. The neon signs flickered with a harsh, artificial intensity that made her feel exposed rather than hidden. She walked through the narrow alleys, but the crowds moved around her like water around a stone, never touching, never acknowledging. The sheer density of the population, the endless rows of high-rise buildings, and the rhythmic, synchronized movement of the commuters began to press against her chest. She realized then that her isolation was not just within the home, it was systemic. The city demanded a specific rhythm, a specific way of being that she could not replicate. Every street corner felt like a reminder of her status as an outsider. She was a singular, discordant note in a city that prized perfect harmony. The hope that had once fueled her arrival was being systematically eroded by the sheer, relentless pressure of a place that had no room for her to simply exist. The grocery store was supposed to be a place of mundane routine, a sanctuary of simple tasks. Lily pushed her cart down the aisle, the metal wheels squeaking rhythmically against the polished linoleum. She reached for a carton of eggs, her hand steady, trying to maintain a facade of belonging. Then, the ambient noise of the store shifted. The rhythmic chatter of the shoppers died down, replaced by a sudden, localized silence. Near the vegetable bins, three elderly women paused. They did not look away when she approached. They turned their heads in unison, their eyes tracking her movement with cold, analytical precision. As she passed, the sound of their voices rose not in greeting, but in a low, jagged cadence of murmurs. They spoke in rapid, hushed tones. She reached for a bag of rice, and the woman closest to her pulled her own basket back, as if the proximity were a physical contamination. She abandoned the cart, the items inside suddenly feeling like evidence of an intrusion she could no longer justify. The school gate was a gauntlet of social precision. Parents gathered in small, tight circles, their conversations flowing with an ease that Lily had never been invited to share. She stood at the periphery, waiting for Junho, her presence acting like a vacuum in the middle of the crowded sidewalk. When she moved closer to the group, the air around her seemed to harden. A mother standing near the entrance turned her back, the movement sharp and deliberate. Another parent adjusted their bag, creating a physical barrier that effectively blocked Lily from the conversation. She offered a small, tentative nod to a woman she had seen every day for months. The woman looked through her, her gaze sliding past Lily to focus on a point in the distance, as if Lily were made of glass. The silence from the group was not empty. It was a wall. It was a calculated, icy detachment that signaled her permanent status as a foreigner. She watched them laugh at a shared comment, a sound that felt like a door locking in her face. Every attempt to bridge the gap was met with a polite, absolute rejection. Back inside the apartment, the silence was different. It was not the cold rejection of the street, but a heavy, stagnant air that clung to the furniture. Lily moved through the rooms, her footsteps muffled by the thick rugs. She picked up a stray toy from the floor and placed it on the shelf, but the shelf felt like a museum display, not a home. She watched Min-ho in the kitchen, his movements precise and repetitive. He did not look at her. He looked through her, as if she were a tool he had picked up to perform a task and would set down when the work was done. She realized then that her presence was not a beginning, but a bridge. She was the patch applied to a gaping hole in their lives, a temporary fix designed to hold the structure together until the grief subsided. Every meal she prepared, every corner she tidied, was merely maintenance for a life that did not belong to her. She stood in the doorway, watching the way they moved around each other, a closed circuit that she could never enter. She was the placeholder, the substitute, a ghost inhabiting a space that had already been claimed by a memory. The realization settled into her chest, cold and immovable. Night brought no relief, only a different set of tasks. Lily moved through the apartment with the practiced efficiency of a shadow. She scrubbed the kitchen counters until they gleamed, the scent of harsh chemicals replacing any trace of a lived-in home. She folded the laundry, her hands moving in rhythmic, mechanical arcs, yet the fabric felt cold and indifferent under her touch. Every surface she polished was a desperate attempt to earn a place in the room, but the apartment remained static, a museum of a life she was not allowed to share. She reached for a stack of books on the side table to reorganize them and found a small, framed photograph tucked behind the lamp. It was a picture of the life that existed before her. She set it back exactly where she found it, her heart tightening with the knowledge that her efforts were merely keeping the dust off a shrine. She finished the dishes, the clatter of porcelain against the sink the only sound in the suffocating quiet. She was needed to maintain the order, to ensure the gears of the household continued to turn, but she was never seen as a participant. She was a utility, a ghost performing labor for a family that looked right through her. When the final light was switched off, the house remained exactly as it had been before she arrived. The apartment air became too thin to breathe. Lily grabbed her umbrella and stepped out into the humid, rain-slicked streets of Seoul. The sky was a bruised purple, weeping a steady drizzle that turned the pavement into a dark, shimmering mirror. She walked without a destination, her boots splashing through puddles that shattered the neon advertisements above. Every reflection was distorted, a fractured version of the city that felt as hollow as her own chest. She passed a storefront where a couple stood laughing under a shared canopy, their shoulders pressed together, oblivious to the storm. Lily tightened her grip on her own handle. Her umbrella was clear, a transparent barrier that kept the rain off her skin but did nothing to shield her from the biting loneliness of the crowd. She walked past the subway entrance, watching the commuters disappear into the earth, each one heading toward a home that waited for them. She looked at her own reflection in a shop window and saw only a silhouette, a ghost moving through a city that had no place for her to land. She returned to the apartment, the lock clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the hallway. She shed her damp coat and hung it in the dark closet, her movements slower than before. The silence of the living room was a physical weight, pressing against her temples. She walked to the kitchen, her feet tracing the same path she had walked 1,000 times. When Min-ho finally entered, he did not look up. He moved past her toward the study, his presence a closed door. Lily took a breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. She spoke his name, a soft sound. The door to his study closed, no response, not even a nod. She stood alone in the kitchen, the realization settled in her gut, heavy and cold. She was not a partner, she was a fixture. The morning sun hit the floorboards, revealing dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Lily began her cycle. She wiped the kitchen counters until they gleamed, then moved to the living room to fold the blankets that lay in crumpled heaps. Every movement was precise, a practiced rhythm of maintenance. She scrubbed the sink, the abrasive sponge rasping against the metal, a sound that filled the void where conversation should have been. She moved to Junho's room, picking up stray blocks and books, placing them back on shelves with a gentle, deliberate touch. She was a ghost tidying a museum. A moment later, Junho walked in, kicked his bag across the floor, and scattered the books she had just aligned. He didn't look at her. He didn't acknowledge the order she had restored. Lily stood still, her hands resting on the back of a chair, watching the chaos return. She walked back to the kitchen and began to polish the wooden table, her cloth moving in slow, circular motions. The wood was already clean, but she kept scrubbing, seeking some tangible result from her labor. The evening meal was a ritual of avoidance. Lily set the bowls of rice and side dishes on the table, the ceramic clinking sharply in the quiet room. She sat, her chair scraping against the floor, and waited. Minho sat opposite her, his eyes fixed on his bowl, his chopsticks moving with mechanical precision. Junho sat between them, his head bowed, his movements small and guarded. Lily watched the steam rise from the soup, the only movement in the room. She reached for the kimchi, her hand hovering near the center of the table. She looked at Minho and asked about his day at the office. He didn't answer immediately. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and then reached for the water pitcher, his gaze sliding past her shoulder. He poured a glass, the liquid splashing slightly, and set the pitcher down without a word. The silence stretched, tight and brittle. Lily turned to Junho, offering a small smile, and asked if he enjoyed his school project. The boy pushed a piece of vegetable around his bowl, his jaw set, and looked toward his father. Minho finally spoke, his voice flat and clipped, telling the boy to finish his food. Lily pulled her hand back, her fingers curling into her palm. They were miles apart. Outside the apartment, the city demanded a version of her that did not exist. Lily walked through the crowded streets, her posture rigid, trying to mirror the subtle, fluid movements of the women around her. She kept her gaze lowered, her steps measured, mimicking the quiet reserve. It was a performance that required every ounce of her focus. At the local market, she stood in line, clutching her basket, listening to the rapid-fire cadence. She tried to catch the rhythm, to anticipate the polite, clipped exchanges, but the language remained a barrier she couldn't bridge. Every time she opened her mouth to speak, the slight hesitation in her tone marked her as an outsider. She felt the weight of 1,000 eyes. She stood on the platform, watching the train arrive, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Her muscles ached from the constant tension. She realized the exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was the fatigue of erasure. She was molding herself into a shape that felt increasingly alien. She gripped the metal railing, her knuckles white, and looked at her own reflection. The face looking back was a stranger, tired and worn. Lily stood in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. She looked at the calendar pinned to the wall, a circle drawn in red ink around the upcoming date. It was Junho's birthday. A sudden, sharp clarity settled over her. She had spent months shrinking, apologizing for her presence, and waiting for an invitation to belong that never came. She realized that passivity had only deepened the chasm. She turned away from the window, her jaw tightening with a new, singular purpose. This would not be another quiet evening. She would bridge the distance herself, not with words, but with a deliberate, undeniable act of care. She began to map out the logistics in her mind, listing the ingredients she would need, the decorations that might catch a child's eye. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles firm, and committed to the plan. She would make them see her. Lily cleared the counters and laid out the ingredients like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. She started with the base for the soup, chopping vegetables until her rhythm was a blur of steel against wood. The air in the kitchen grew thick with the scent of garlic and ginger. She spent the first hour testing the broth, adjusting the salt. A sudden flare-up on the stove scorched the bottom of a pan, sending a plume of acrid smoke into the room. She worked through the heat, her forehead damp, refusing to let a single mistake compromise the result. She moved to the side dishes, folding the ingredients with precise, repetitive motions. Every action was a calculated move. She spent 3 more hours refining the presentation, arranging the plates with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. The meal was ready, a sprawling testament to her effort, waiting in the silence of the apartment for the moment of truth. The apartment settled into a heavy, unnatural stillness. Lily stood by the dining table, her palms pressed flat against the wood. The candles she had lit were burning low, their flames flickering in the stagnant air. She checked the clock on the wall. The second hand swept past the hour, then the next, its rhythmic ticking sounding like a hammer against the silence. She walked to the window, peering down at the street below, but the sidewalk remained empty. She turned back to the table. The steam had long since stopped rising from the bowls, and the edges of the food were beginning to dry. She reached out to straighten a napkin, her fingers trembling slightly. She adjusted the centerpiece, then moved it back, her movements becoming frantic and aimless. The apartment felt too large, the shadows stretching across the floor as the evening light faded into a deep, bruised purple. She tried to steady her breathing, but the quiet was absolute. It was a vacuum that seemed to pull the warmth right out of the room. The anticipation had curdled into a cold, hard knot in her chest. The lock clicked. A sharp, metallic snap that echoed through the hallway. Lily spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. She smoothed her hands down her sides, took a breath, and stepped toward the foyer. The door swung inward. Minho stepped across the threshold, the weight of the day visible in the slump of his shoulders. He didn't look up immediately, his keys jingling as he tossed them into the bowl. Lily scanned the space behind him, her eyes darting to the hallway, then to the stairwell. The corridor was empty. No small shadow followed him. No backpack hit the floor. No familiar voice called out. He closed the door, the latch clicking into place. Lily stood frozen, her gaze locked on the empty space where a 6-year-old boy should have been. The silence was a heavy, suffocating void. Minho finally looked up, his eyes glassy and unfocused, as if he had forgotten she was even standing there. The birthday cake on the table seemed to lose its color. The reality of the empty apartment hit her like a physical blow. Minho walked past her, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. He did not look at the table. He did not notice the streamers or the cake. He simply loosened his tie and sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion that had no room for anyone else. Lily stayed where she was, her hands clenched at her sides. She pointed toward the untouched meal, her voice barely a whisper. "I spent all afternoon on this." For him, Minho stopped, his back to her, and let out a short, hollow laugh. He turned around, his expression one of mild, detached confusion. "Junho is at his grandmother's house," he said, as if stating the weather. "I thought I mentioned it." He didn't wait for a response. He moved toward the kitchen, his movements mechanical and indifferent. He reached for a glass of water, his posture relaxed, completely unaware of the wreckage he had just caused. Lily watched him, the reality of his casual dismissal cutting deeper than any argument. The effort she had poured into the evening was not just ignored, it was rendered invisible. Lily stood in the center of the room, the air suddenly thin. She looked at the table, the cake, the streamers. They were props in a play she had been performing alone. Minho was in the kitchen, the sound of running water drowning out the ticking clock. She walked to the bookshelf, running her fingers over the spines of books she had organized. They felt cold. She realized then that she had been living in a museum of someone else's memory. Every chore, every meal, every attempt to bridge the distance had been a desperate effort to occupy a space that was already filled by a ghost. She was not a partner. She was a placeholder. She looked at her own reflection in the darkened window. She was a silhouette against the city lights, barely there, fading into the background, of a life that didn't belong to her. The realization settled into her bones, heavy and absolute. The cage door had not just closed, it had locked from the outside. She was a ghost in her own home, haunting a life that had no room for her existence. The silence of the apartment was no longer a void to be filled, but a cage to be escaped. Lily did not move. She watched Minho through the doorway. He was wiping the counter, his movements rhythmic and entirely focused on the surface, not the person standing a few feet away. She looked at the kitchen tiles, counting the grout lines, forcing her mind to anchor itself in the physical world. The desperation that had fueled her for months, the need to prove her worth, to earn her place, simply evaporated. It left behind a hollow, metallic taste in her mouth. She realized that no amount of cleaning or cooking would ever turn this house into a home. She was an intruder in a shrine. She walked past Minho, but he did not turn. He continued his task, his presence now as insignificant as a piece of furniture. She reached the hallway and stopped. The air felt different here, away from his orbit. She looked at her hands, steady and dry. The frantic pulse in her throat had slowed to a calm, rhythmic beat. The snap was not a loud event. It was the quiet sound of a lock clicking open. She was done. She turned back toward the bedroom, her footsteps deliberate, each one marking the end of a role she would never play again. The bedroom was still. The evening light stretched across the floorboards, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Lily stood by the bed, her breathing slow and measured. She looked at the nightstand, at the small framed photograph of Minho and Junho. She did not reach for it. She did not feel the usual ache of exclusion. Instead, she saw the frame as an object, glass and wood, occupying space. She walked to the closet and slid the door open. The hangers rattled, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the quiet. She reached for her suitcase, the leather cool and firm under her grip. She placed it on the bed, the zipper teeth catching for a second, before she pulled it open with a steady, fluid motion. Every movement was precise. There was no hesitation, no lingering glance at the life she was discarding. She picked up a stack of books from the desk, their weight familiar, and set them onto the bed. She was not leaving in a panic. She was leaving with the clarity of a surgeon. The apartment was no longer a home or a cage. It was simply a place she had occupied, and now it was a place she was vacating. She gripped the edge of the suitcase, ready to fill the void with her own life. Lily reached for the first book on the shelf. It was a heavy, worn copy of a novel she had brought from home. Her fingers traced the spine, feeling the texture of the paper, a sharp contrast to the sterile, polished surfaces of the apartment. She slid it into the suitcase. The weight of the book against the base of the bag felt like a foundation. She moved to the next shelf, pulling down a collection of essays. She did not stack them neatly. She placed them with purpose, creating a barrier between her past and the space she was about to occupy. She picked up a notebook, its pages filled with her own thoughts, observations, and plans she had tucked away for years. She opened it, scanned a single sentence, and closed it firmly. This was not just packing. It was an inventory of herself. She worked with rhythmic efficiency, clearing the shelves of every item that belonged to her. Each book added to the suitcase was a reclamation of her own time. She ignored the framed photos and the trinkets that Minho had given her. By the time the shelf was bare, the suitcase was heavy, and the room felt lighter. She stood back, looking at the empty space, and felt the quiet surge of a person who had finally found the exit. The door creaked, breaking the rhythm of her packing. Minho stood in the frame, his hands still resting on the door handle. He looked at the suitcase on the bed, then at the bare, hollowed-out shelves. His brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his face as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit. He stepped into the room, his movements hesitant, almost cautious. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. When he saw the lack of hesitation in her eyes, he reached out, his fingers hovering in the air near her arm, but she shifted her weight, stepping neatly out of his reach. The movement was small, yet it carried the force of a wall. Minho looked around the room again, his gaze darting from the empty desk to the suitcase. The confusion in his eyes began to sharpen. He saw the space she had already vacated and understood, for the first time, that the void was about to become permanent. Lily stood in the center of the room, the suitcase handle gripped tight in her hand. She looked at the table, then at Minho, who remained frozen in the doorway. Her movements were deliberate, stripped of the frantic energy that had defined her previous weeks. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold brass house keys. They felt heavy, weighted with the history of a life she had tried to build and the expectations she had failed to meet. She did not throw them. She placed them on the mahogany surface of the dining table. The sound was sharp, a clean, metallic clink that cut through the heavy silence of the apartment like a blade. She let go of the handle of her suitcase for a moment, just to ensure the keys were perfectly centered. Lily did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The air in the room had already thinned, leaving no space for arguments or pleas. She looked directly at Minho, her gaze steady, devoid of the hurt that had once clouded her vision. "I am not a mirror for your past," she said. The words were flat, stripped of malice, yet they hit him with the force of a physical impact. Min-ho opened his mouth, his face twisting into a mask of denial, but she continued before he could speak. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a ghost to fill a seat at your table. She watched him shrink, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth. He tried to reach for her hand, a desperate, reflexive gesture, but she took a step back, maintaining the distance. He finally spoke, his voice cracking, admitting he had instructed his son to keep his distance, terrified that love would erase the memory of his late wife. Lily listened to the confession, not with anger, but with a sudden, chilling clarity. She turned toward the door, the truth acting as the final key to her freedom. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound swallowed by the quiet of the hallway. Lily walked down the stairs, her footsteps echoing against the concrete. Outside, the early morning mist clung to the streets of Seoul, dampening the city's usual roar. She stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and looked up at the window of the apartment. It was just a square of glass now, no longer a home, no longer a cage. The air felt cool against her skin, sharp and clean. She took a deep breath, the humidity of the night replaced by the crisp promise of a new day. She turned away from the building and began to walk. The subway station was ahead, a cavern of fluorescent light and movement, but she did not rush. The stares of strangers no longer felt like judgment. They were simply the background noise of a city that did not know her, and for the first time, that anonymity felt like a gift. She had no role to play. It was the vast, open space of a life that belonged entirely to her. The subway platform was nearly empty. Lily stood near the yellow safety line, watching the tracks. A train approached from the dark tunnel, its headlights cutting through the gloom, casting long, shifting shadows across the platform. She caught her reflection in the glass of a vending machine. She saw the set of her jaw, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and the way she held her own weight without leaning on anything. There was no one to please, no honorifics to rehearse, and no kitchen to clean. The train screeched to a halt, the doors sliding open with a mechanical hiss. She stepped inside, finding a seat near the window. As the doors closed, the station began to recede, turning into a blur of gray and white. She watched the city lights streak past, no longer feeling like an outsider looking in, but like a traveler passing through. The weight of the last 3 years had dissolved into the hum of the moving carriage. She pulled a small notebook from her bag, opened to a blank page, and picked up a pen. She was no longer a shadow in someone else's story. She was the author of her own. The train emerged from the subterranean darkness, climbing toward the elevated tracks that spanned the river. Sunlight flooded the carriage, turning the metal surfaces bright and sharp. Lily watched the city skyline flatten, the dense clusters of high-rises giving way to the sprawling, open edges of the metropolis. She stood up as the train slowed, the brakes grinding against the rails. The station name announced itself over the intercom, a place she had never visited before. She stepped onto the platform, the air here smelling of damp earth and distant traffic rather than the recycled atmosphere of the city center. She walked toward the exit, her pace unhurried. Outside, the morning sun was fully risen, casting long, clear shadows across the pavement. She reached the street level and stopped. There was no schedule to follow, no dinner to prepare, and no one waiting for her to be anything other than herself. She turned left, away from the familiar routes, and began to walk into the bright, unmapped space of the day. Every step was hers. Every direction was a choice. The market stalls were already active, vendors calling out prices and stacking crates of fresh produce. Lily wove through the narrow aisles, her movements fluid and purposeful. She stopped at a stall, picked up a piece of fruit, examined it, and placed it back without feeling the need to purchase anything to please a household. She was simply a person in a crowd, one of many, invisible in the best possible way. The noise of the market faded as she turned into a small, tree-lined park. She found a wooden bench, wiped the morning dew from the seat with her hand, and sat down. She opened her notebook, the blank paper bright against the dark wood of the bench. She uncapped her pen, the click echoing in the quiet space. She began to write, her hand moving across the page with steady, rhythmic strokes. There were no more honorifics to consider, no more expectations to meet, and no more ghosts to haunt her living room. She watched a group of birds take flight from a nearby branch, their wings beating against the clear sky. She looked back at her page, finished a sentence, and closed the book. The city hummed around her, but she was still anchored by her own resolve. The park path led her to a glass-walled pedestrian bridge overlooking the main thoroughfare. Below, the traffic flowed like a river of light, constant and indifferent. Lily stopped at the glass, her reflection staring back. She did not look for the woman who cooked, cleaned, or waited. She looked for the person who had walked away. She touched the cold surface of the glass, tracing the outline of her own face. The city lights flickered in the background, but they no longer felt like a cage. They were just lights, distant and small. She turned away from the glass and walked toward the far end of the bridge. Her stride was long, steady, and entirely her own. She reached the stairs, descended to the street, and merged into the flow of pedestrians. She did not look back at the apartment, the bookstore, or the life she had left behind. The sidewalk stretched out before her, wide and clear. She adjusted her grip on her bag, felt the weight of her own choices, and kept moving. The morning air cooled against her skin as she crossed the street. She was gone, and for the first time, she was exactly where she needed to be. The subway entrance loomed ahead, a concrete mouth swallowing the morning commuters. Lily descended the stairs, the air growing cooler, and smelling of ozone and damp stone. She reached the turnstiles and stopped. She did not head toward the line that led to the bookstore, or the neighborhood she once called home. Instead, she walked to the map on the wall. She traced a finger along the colored lines, then chose a route heading toward the coast. She swiped her card, the gate clicked open, and she stepped through. On the platform, she stood near the edge, watching the tunnel darkness. The train arrived, a rush of wind and screeching metal. She stepped inside, finding a seat by the window. As the doors slid shut, the reflection in the glass showed a woman who was no longer waiting for anyone. The train lurched forward, accelerating into the black tunnel. She watched the station lights blur into streaks of white. She pulled her notebook from her bag, opened to a fresh page, and began to write. The train rattled. She was moving toward the end of the line. The train burst from the tunnel, and the gray concrete of the city gave way to the sharp blue of the coastline. Sunlight flooded the carriage, hitting the floor in bright, geometric shapes. Lily watched the ocean appear, a vast, shifting expanse that dwarfed the skyline she had left behind. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small, brass key, and dropped it into the trash bin near the doors. It made a hollow, metallic sound that was swallowed by the train's roar. She felt the weight in her pocket vanish. The train slowed, the brakes hissing as it pulled into the terminal. She stood, smoothed her coat, and walked onto the platform. The air here smelled of salt and wet sand. She did not look for a taxi or a map. She walked toward the sound of the waves, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The horizon was wide, unobstructed, and entirely open. She stepped forward, leaving the tracks behind, and walked into the morning light. The sand was cold beneath her feet, firm and packed from the receding tide. Lily walked along the waterline, watching the foam swirl around her ankles. She picked up a smooth, bleached piece of driftwood, turning it over in her hands. It was weathered, scarred by the salt and the constant battering of the waves, much like the life she had just abandoned. She looked at the wood, then tossed it back into the surf. She watched it bob once, twice, before the current pulled it out into the deep. The act was small, but the finality of it resonated in her chest. She turned her back to the ocean and faced the path ahead. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, turning the mist into a golden haze. She didn't look back at the train station or the city skyline hidden behind the hills. Her stride was steady, rhythmic, and purposeful. She was no longer a mirror for someone else's grief or a placeholder in a family that never truly saw her. She was simply a woman walking into her own future. The horizon stretched out, infinite and inviting. She adjusted her bag, took a deep breath of the sharp, clean air, and kept moving forward into the light. Beyond the dunes, the path widened into a bustling coastal square. The smell of roasted nuts and fresh bread replaced the salt air. Lily slowed her pace, watching the vendors arrange their stalls. She didn't hurry past them as she once had in the city. She stopped at a small stall, observing the intricate patterns on handmade ceramics. The artisan looked up and offered a nod, a simple gesture of recognition. She bought a cup of tea, the ceramic warm against her palms. She sat on a wooden bench, watching the crowd flow around her like water. For the first time in years, she was not performing a role or waiting for a signal from someone else. She was just a person in a public space, belonging to herself. She finished the tea and placed the cup on the table. The sun was high now, casting sharp, clear shadows on the pavement. She stood up, adjusted her bag, and turned toward the main road that led further into the town. She walked with a steady, unhurried gait. The weight of the past had dissolved, leaving only the clarity of the present moment. She moved forward, leaving the bench behind, and disappeared into the vibrant pulse of the day. The road ahead stretched toward the mountains, a ribbon of gray cutting through the green landscape. Lily reached the junction where the coastal path met the main thoroughfare. A weathered signpost stood at the corner, its paint peeling under the sun. She stopped, reading the names of towns she had never visited, places where no one knew her name or expected her to play a part. She traced the letters with her finger, feeling the rough wood grain. The choice was hers alone. She turned away from the coast and stepped onto the road leading inland. Her boots struck the pavement with a rhythmic, confident sound. She did not check her watch or look for a bus. She walked because she wanted to see what lay around the next bend. The air grew cooler as she gained elevation, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. She passed a small orchard, the branches heavy with fruit, and reached out to brush a leaf. It was a simple, tactile connection to the world around her. She was no longer a ghost, haunting a home that was never hers. She was a traveler, mapping her own journey, 1 mile at a time. The road rose to meet the sky, and she followed it, leaving the silence of her past far behind. The ridge gave way to a vast, sun-drenched valley. Lily stopped at the crest, the wind pressing against her skin. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small silver key to the apartment she had left behind. It felt cold and heavy, a relic of a life that no longer held power over her. She held it for a moment, watching the light catch the metal, then opened her hand and let it drop into the tall grass below. She did not look to see where it landed. The act was final. She took a deep breath, the air sharp with the scent of wild herbs. The path ahead was steep, winding down into the green expanse where the future waited, unscripted and entirely her own. She began the descent, her stride long and sure. Every step took her further from the silence of the past. She walked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip. She was home, not in a place, but in herself. The road narrowed into a cobblestone street, leading Lily into the heart of a vibrant town. The sound of voices, laughter, and clattering dishes filled the air. She moved through the crowd, no longer an observer, but a participant in the rhythm of the day. She paused before a storefront, her gaze catching on the glass. A reflection stared back, not a shadow, not a placeholder, but a person standing firmly on solid ground. She touched the cold surface of the window, tracing the outline of her own face. The realization settled in, quiet and absolute. She was not defined by the expectations of others or the roles she had been forced to play. She was the architect of her own existence. She turned away from the glass and stepped back into the flow of the street. A vendor called out a greeting, and she answered with a genuine smile. The sun reached its zenith, bathing the square in light. She merged into the throng, disappearing into the life she had finally claimed. The town square began to quiet as the light softened into the deep hues of dusk. Lily found a wooden bench near a fountain, the water rhythmic and steady against the stone. She sat, resting her hands on her knees, and watched the shadows stretch across the plaza. The weight that had defined her existence for so long was gone, replaced by a clarity that felt like cool water. She looked at the people passing by, strangers living their own complex lives, and felt a profound sense of connection to the world. She was no longer a ghost haunting a home that never wanted her. She was a woman choosing her own direction. A street lamp flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the pavement. She stood up, the movement fluid and deliberate. She took one last look at the fountain, the spray catching the artificial light, and turned toward the path leading out of the square. The journey was over, and for the first time, the horizon was not a limit, but an invitation. She stepped forward, leaving the past entirely behind. The path ahead wound through a quiet grove of trees, the leaves rustling in the evening breeze. Lily walked with a steady, rhythmic stride, the sound of her boots on the gravel marking the passage of time. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished key, the last remnant of the apartment that had once held her captive. She stopped at the edge of a bridge, looked down at the dark water flowing beneath, and opened her hand. The key fell, vanishing into the current without a sound. A sudden lightness settled in her chest. She turned back to the path, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the first stars were beginning to pierce the twilight. She did not look back. Every step took her further from the life she had outgrown and closer to the one she was building. She reached a fork in the road, a wooden signpost standing tall against the darkening sky. She chose the path that led toward the coast, the scent of salt air already faint on the wind. Her hands were empty, her mind was clear, and her future was entirely her own. The sound of the ocean grew louder, a rhythmic roar that drowned out the lingering echoes of her past. Lily crested the final dune, the sand shifting beneath her feet. She walked down to the shoreline, where the tide pulled back, leaving the wet earth smooth and reflective. She stopped, digging her heels into the cool, firm sand. The horizon was beginning to glow with the first light of morning. She stood still, breathing in the sharp, salt-heavy air, feeling the spray hit her face. There was no weight in her pockets, no expectations to meet, and no roles to play. She was simply a person standing on the edge of a vast, open space. The sun broke the line of the water, casting a long, golden path across the waves. She watched the light expand, turning the gray sea into a field of shimmering gold. She turned away from the land, facing the open water, and took a deep, steady breath. The silence of the morning was not empty. It was full of potential. She stepped forward, leaving her footprints behind, and walked into the light. If you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel.